Okay, so from this point on in the book of Revelation, it kind of closes down and focus, because what we're doing is we're winding up to the culmination of all things and the re-establishment of the rule of Christ right across the earth, and of Christ across the earth. So in Revelation, we've essentially got that condensed all into 5 chapters. And it's the winding up of everything of God's plan to restore the kingdom in its fullness. So from chapter 17 onwards, we effectively, we have this contrast between 2 women, are not individuals as such. They are personifications of places and systems. The 2 systems that have existed since very early in Genesis, one called Babylon and one called the city of God, but also the bride of Christ. And these 2 personifications are absolute contrasts with each other. One is called a filthy harlot, and the other is called the spotless bride. And each of these 2 women, these 2 personifications, are connected to a city. So the filthy harlot is connected to a city, Babylon, and the spotless bride is connected to a city of Jerusalem. And when we look at the way that Babylon gets described in these passages, what we find is that it effectively represents the fullness of man's pride and man's greed. The pride of man being reflected in the architecture and the grandness of this city, but also this idea that greed and merchants and banks and shipping and everything is focused on this place of Babylon. Now, in that sense, and what we'll find is that both chapter 17 and 18, it's kind of interchangeable with whether this is talking about a single physical place, the actual city of Babylon, or whether it's talking about the system or the world system of doing things based on greed and pride and success and clambering over each other to get success, and this obsession with status and wealth and money and trade. So in that sense, Babylon becomes the focus and the sign of the personification of rebellion. It also becomes the place where the man's focus and man's, bondage to mammon is there in all its fullness. When Jesus talked about, mammon, it had a twofold thing. One of which is when we talk about mammon, we just think money or wealth, but actually, mammon was also a god. He was a pagan god, and he was the god of money and getting things and possessions. And so this city of Babylon in Revelation is not just a physical place, it's also a personification of all the world systems that are set up to run our lives and the way that the world works apart from God. And that's been there since almost the beginning of Genesis. Babylon appears really early on the scene in Genesis, although it's not called Babylon at the time, but it's a city that comes into being, and it's established by a man called Nimrod. And Nimrod wanted to build a tower that reached to the sphere of God. He wanted to climb up to the level of God. He was a very powerful warrior type person, and he wanted to exert his power to climb up to the level of God. And so the first appearance we see of Babylon, it's actually called Babel, the Tower of Babel. So that's where Babylon comes from, and you'll all be familiar how it keeps reappearing through the Bible, how it's used to bring judgment on Israel, and it conquers Israel. And we've talked in this series as well about how the kind of history, the timeline, Daniel's kingdoms, how he interrelated with Nebuchadnezzar, the ruler of the Babylonian Empire, and so on. And this theme, this contrast between God's people and God's city and the world's system and the world's city runs right through the Bible. And what we're going to see in these chapters is God finally take control back out of the world systems by the destruction of not just this physical place which gets destroyed, but also the destruction of the spirit behind that physical place. And so let's start at chapter 17. We're going to just kind of do a pretty much a line-by-line study tonight. And in chapter 17, beginning at verse 1, it says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters.'" I'll explain that in a minute. "With whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication." Now, what's that talking about? Well, the context of those verses, the context of this, what starts in chapter 17, is that John has just seen the 7th bowl judgment. The bowl judgments are the last series of judgments where God and the 7th judgment of the bowls, God pours out the bowl of his wrath upon Babylon. And when you look at the end of chapter 16, you see that's associated with a great earthquake. And it says that was such an earthquake that had never been seen or occurred before on the earth. So it's off the scale of all those earthquakes we talked about right at the start of this series on the end times. It's an earthquake like has never occurred before. And also in that 7th judgment, what we see is that there's hail comes from heaven, and the hailstorm is in huge bowls, very big hailstone bowls, not just little things. And that causes a lot of death, and it causes men, we're told, to blaspheme against God. And what happens in chapter 17 is that the angel takes John aside, and he expands the details of what is going on there, and what the significance of this judgment of Babylon is. And we kind of get this zooming in on this final bowl judgment, zooming into God's ending of all things. And it's almost like coming full circle since the beginning of Genesis. We're kind of 5 or 6 chapters off the end of Revelation. Babylon, the Tower of Babel, comes in on the scene around about the 5th, 6th chapter of Genesis. It's the full circle, the completeness of what's happening. And I think it's kind of interesting that one of the things that we find here is this idea of hail. Because what you'll remember from, I guess, maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, is that there was in these judgments that come, there is a comet strike, there is asteroids hit the Earth, and there's basically dust goes up into the atmosphere, shuts out the sun, there's darkness across the sun. What you find in the bowl judgments is that there's another comet or asteroid that hits the Earth called Wormwood, and that turns the seas bitter. It's a poison. It brings poison and poisonous minerals with it. And I found this really interesting because when I was kind of preparing for this study, I was actually reading what is effectively a science fiction story based on the science around these things. And it was a story about a comet strike on the Earth. And what would happen if a comet hit the Earth is, obviously it caused a lot of destruction. The dust would go up into the atmosphere. There'd initially be everything would heat up very quickly, but as that dust blocked out the sun, what happens is the Earth cools, and it cools rapidly. And so that following this kind of very hot conditions created immediately after the comet strike, what you get a little bit later is you get cold. You get, like, if it was allowed to continue, you get a new ice age coming. So it's really interesting that one of the end results, having seen those two comets, is that you get this hail coming down, which is huge balls of ice. What's amazing about that? Why do I tell you that? Well, if you think about it from John's position, he wouldn't have known any of that. You know, they didn't have telescopes. They hadn't put men on the moon. They didn't have NASA. They didn't have all that science understanding we have. This is 2,000 years ago, and to describe these things is absolutely amazing. And that shows me that he'd actually seen these things. He got these things from God, and they stack up scientifically. And that's really interesting, because often when people read Revelation, they think, oh, well, you know, it's all like imagery and that. No, these are real things that will happen in that final period. And so this place, Babylon, it's described as the mother of harlots. And the description that we're given here of the woman shows John describing this harlot in very similar terms to some prophecies that both Isaiah and Jeremiah had made about the right at the end, about the fulfillment of all things. Because what there is in the prophecies of Isaiah and Jeremiah is they prophesy the complete destruction of Babylon in such a way that it can never be rebuilt, that there would be nothing left. And here's what Jeremiah says: "O you who dwell by many waters, abundant in treasures, your end has come." And during the time of Jeremiah, Babylon was noted because it actually sits on lots of different waters. It sits in the middle of lots of different rivers. It's in what you would call ancient Mesopotamia. It's surrounded by these rivers, you know, the river Euphrates and all the rest of it. And the Euphrates divides and forms lots of kind of islands and lakes. And that's where Babylon sits. And when, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar's empire, Babylon was the largest city, 2,500 acres. I mean, it's huge. You know, that's big for a city now, let alone in that time. And so this description of the city, or Babylon, sitting on many waters, or the harlot sitting on many waters, he says the great harlot now sits on many waters. And then in verse 15 of chapter 17, he says, those many waters represent peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. So you've got this physical picture of Babylon sitting on many waters, and then you've got this personification, the harlot, the spirit behind the system. And John's saying that represents people, multitudes, nations, and tongues. In other words, the influence of this spirit, the influence of that thinking, the influence of this Babylonian ethos is driven by greed and the desire for possessions and pride and their own achievements. Let me just go to a screen share, and then I can show you a picture of where Babylon is. And you can see what he's talking about in terms of many waters. This is the Euphrates, and Babylon sits here, right in the middle. This is down here. We've got the sea and the Gulf, and what we've sorry, it's not the Gulf. It goes off to India there. You've got Babylon there, and you can see how it sits where all these many waters divide. So basically, what John's saying is, physically, that's what Babylon looks like, but spiritually, that's what Babylon looks like too. It sits and its influences across many different streams, all different groups of peoples, all different nations, and it's across multitudes of societies and ethnic groups. So you can see there the two aspects that he's bringing out. Okay, so let's go on to verse 3. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. So, what we got there? Well, the first thing is that this woman sits on a scarlet beast. And that word for scarlet there, which is the Greek word kokinon, it's actually referring to something that is a particular colour that they had, that they used to dye the scarlet cloth of the time. And it came from a scarlet berry, berry in quotation marks, because actually what it was is it was a female insect, and that looked like a berry, and they used to crush it to make this red dye. And what this is saying is that this beast, who is scarlet through and through, is related to what had already been described as the fiery red dragon, which empowers it. So there's a beast, and it is empowered by the red dragon. Who's the red dragon? The red dragon is Satan. So her sitting, this idea of this woman sitting on the beast, it's not that she is dominant over the beast. It's not that she's running things. It's actually that the beast is carrying her, that it's supporting her. So the idea is that she's not ruling over it, but that the beast is behind the spirit of this age. So Satan is behind the spirit of this age. And her purple and scarlet clothing, that's called fine linen. And so basically the idea here is this represents the wealth and the ambition and the pride of nations. And her, what she's wearing reflects her commercialism. Revelation 18, when we get to it, 12 and 16, talks about this. And it talks about the merchandise of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk and scarlet. And one of the things we find from this passage is that, and why I think that this is kind of a twofold prophecy relating to a physical place called Babylon, but also the spirit behind that and the way that's affected the systems in the world, is it doesn't call Babylon just the harlot. It calls Babylon the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. So what's that saying? Well, effectively, I think it's saying that what was birthed in Babylon way back at the Tower of Babel birthed all the abominations in that cup which she serves. The thing that is now about to be dealt with, and that fullness of the evil in the world has roots stretching back, way back in history, and all the way back to Babel. And that's why her name carries this word mystery. And the word mystery there, it's not a name as such. What it is it's saying, well, you can't know these things by natural means. You can't understand the spiritual behind the physical systems. You can't understand the spiritual influence that is causing all this amongst men and the way that the world is running right at the end. And the antidote to that sort of mystery is not investigation to solve a mystery. The antidote to it is revelation. And that's what we're getting right here. Basically, this angel is exposing to John and saying, all this is what is going to be going on in the earth right at the end. And the earth is going to be so corrupted, and the evil on the earth and men's sin are going to be so accumulated that this cup of abominations finally is filled and overflowing. And there's a completeness of the evil of man that it reaches its height. And John says, when I saw her, I marveled with great amazement. You might remember that's kind of something that happens to people occasionally in the word, and when they receive some sort of revelation from God that just blows their mind. You might remember that when Daniel got his vision of Antiochus Epiphanes, he fell over and he fainted, and he was sick for days afterwards because it was so shocking. And what we've got here is John is similarly sort of affected by the magnitude of what's been shown to him, and he's shocked that how she's supported by this hideous beast. He's shocked by how much wealth she has accumulated, how concentrated that wealth is, how that wealth is used to tread down and walk upon others. He's shocked by her extreme sinfulness, that is reached this culmination in the fullness of the cup of abomination. And he's shocked by the scope of this thing, that it's both right through the ages and it's across the earth, many nations, many tongues geographically. And, effectively what John's doing is he's looking at it 2,000 years ago from now, and he's seeing this, and he's seeing what the end's going to be, and he cannot get his head around the times we're living in. He cannot get his head around a world that has departed so far from God and is so full of the evil of men. And it shocks him that this can spread right across the earth. Let's go on, verse 7. But the angel said to me, why did you marvel? I'll tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay, we're back in the 10 horns. Who remembers 10 horns from Daniel? That's what it's talking about. The beast you saw was, and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit, and will go to perdition. So basically what the angel is now explaining to John, this vision he's just seen, and explaining to him what's going to happen. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel. Not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was, and is not, and yet is. The first thing you see there really is this was, is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go to perdition. And you also see that it repeats it and says was and is not and yet is. Contrast that with the description of Jesus. Jesus saying that I was, I am, and I am yet to come. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning of end. And what this is doing is contrasting with that. Now, what we find is, and again, it's this description, the woman on the beast that's carrying her. And so the beast initially supports this system, And the idea is that he empowers it, he gives it strength for his own purposes. However, what happens right at the end, according to Revelation, and we'll see this verses 16 and 17 of this same chapter, is the beast eventually has his 10 kings turn on Babylon and consume her. And that kind of triggers off the whole judgment of that place and that system. Why does he do that? Because she starts to, he cannot stand to have anybody attract worship or attention away from him. And I'll explain to you why that is in a minute. Now, let's have a look at those words, because this is the explanation. Was and is not and will ascend and go to perdition. That might sound like a riddle, but it is actually a hugely important verse when you put it together with what Daniel said in his prophecies, which we studied some weeks ago. It's an incredibly accurate description of what will happen to the beast. Now, who's the beast? The beast is not Satan himself, but at this point, or at a point, becomes possessed of Satan. So the beast that we're talking about is actually the Antichrist. And the Antichrist sets off in a way that supports the world system, endorses the world system, endorses the evil in the world, and he carries that system. So what's the was? The was is referring to Daniel 9, 26 and 27, and it's his original, he comes, he appears, the restrainer is removed, and the man of lawlessness appears on the scene, and we see him for who he is. So that's the was. What's the is not? Well, Zechariah prophesied this, but in Revelation 13, we see this event described, but the Antichrist is, after 3.5 years, is murdered. It says he dies from a mortal wound. We don't know how he's murdered. We don't know how precisely any more details than that, but basically he's killed. And then he says, but then he will ascend, because Revelation 13 verse 3 says not just that he stays dead, but that he is resurrected. And the way he's resurrected is Satan enters him, possesses him, and gives him life. So halfway through, there's a turning point. Nations, all the things that we recognize as running on the earth, and then suddenly the Antichrist is fully possessed, having been dead and resurrected, and he's full of Satan, and that brings his final terrible 3.5 years. But ultimately, to perdition, his destruction is certain in the hands of Christ at the second coming. One thing that he does, and going back to something we looked at a couple of weeks ago, one thing he does on his ascent, on his resurrection, when he's possessed of Satan, is that he comes and he kills the two witnesses. He overthrows the two witnesses. And basically the result of overthrowing the two witnesses and his own resurrection from the dead results in global worship of him. And at that point, he proclaims himself God. And, that's the shocking thing that we've been told about, the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not. We've been into all that sort of thing. But why do people turn? Why do they all follow him? Why do they worship him? Why do they follow him even though all these terrible things are happening in the world? Why do they follow him despite the witness of the two witnesses? Because he's been murdered and raised from the dead, and he proclaims himself God, and they say, there's the Messiah. Just like Jesus rose from the dead, he's risen from the dead. He must be God. And so the world turns and looks to him. But he's not God. He's a counterfeit. He is Satan personified. And it says he rises from the bottomless pit. and that bottomless pit, we don't actually know where it is, but whether it's part of or a compartment of a place called Hades, or whether it's actually the gulf between Hades and Abraham's bosom or paradise. So it's really not clear exactly what it is. What we do know is that the bottomless pit that he rises out of reappears because he's going to be locked back into that place. And we'll come to that probably next week or the week after when we look at the millennium. So we've got this incredible, miraculous resurrection of the beast. He comes, he destroys the two witnesses. Remember, people have tried to kill the witnesses before and nobody could get near them. They could call down fire, they could stop the rain, they could do all these things, and yet he is able to kill them and assume total control with the world looking to him and worshipping him. And what you see there is that this is a full circle of Daniel's prophecy. It's all coming to fruition. I want to show you a slide now that just illustrates how this all links in with Daniel's prophecy, because what John is seeing in full technicolor in front of him, getting it explained to him by the angels, is exactly the things that Daniel prophesied. So we're going to be sending these slides around with the video this week. I'll send them to Jules after this. But what you can see is how there's certain characteristics that are common between what Daniel calls the little horn or the Antichrist and this beast of Revelation. He speaks pompous words. The beast of Revelation blasphemes. He's given authority for, in Daniel, a times and half years. In Revelation, he's given authority for 42 months. Persecutes the saints. He prevails over them. In Revelation, he overcomes the saints. He makes martyrs. He rules globally. He's proclaimed a king. He has eyes like a man. In the beast in Revelation is described as having the number of a man. And yet he's destined for perdition. He's destined for desolation. He's destined for defeat. And when's the time of his destruction? Both of these visions agree. In Daniel, it's when the saints receive the kingdom. And in Revelation, it's when the saints receive the kingdom. And that's the beauty of biblical prophecy, that there are not differences. They are completely consistent. They are not yet fulfilled, but every prophecy, there's hundreds of prophecies that have already been fulfilled, and the only ones that are not yet fulfilled are these that relate to the time of the end. And this is just so accurate, so consistent. You know, people go, well, yeah, the Bible's inconsistent, it contradicts itself. No, it doesn't. It's absolutely accurate. We can see in Revelation the exact things Daniel talked about, good, I guess it's what, 600 plus years earlier. And now we see those two things, and Daniel and John are both looking forward, and they're looking forward to a time of the end, which obviously we are 2,000 years closer to than they ever were. And it's just, I just think it's astonishing. So let's just carry on. Verse 9. Here is the mind which has wisdom. The seven heads, and again, he's just going to describe some of the things we've heard in Daniel and add some more detail. The seven heads are seven mountains on which the woman sits. There are also seven kings. 5 have fallen, one is, and the other has not yet come. And when he comes, he will must continue a short time. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to perdition. And it's this point when people go, okay, this is blowing my head, I can't understand Revelation. It's not difficult when you just take it for what it's saying. It's very clear what we're talking about here, because it is so like what Daniel talked about. And then he says, the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings. You know, the angels explain it to us what all this means, who have received no kingdom as yet. So their kingdoms aren't in place at the time of John. but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. So they have authority for a short period of time right at the end of days. These are of one mind, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. They delegate and sit under and rule under the authority of the beast, and they put their power behind him. They will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them. For he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called chosen and faithful. Then he said to me, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh and burn her with fire. In other words, that whole system that I said earlier, that he's risen on the back of, he ultimately wants everything for himself, all the nations of the world looking to him. So he takes that system out of the way, and he opens the way for the judgment of the physical place called Babylon and the systems of the world, the spirit of the world, also called Babylon. For God has put into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind, and to give their king to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. God is driving this whole process. These demons think they've got it. These kings think they're acting of their own accord, but God's got it all in hand. He's in total control of this whole process of shutting down everything, bringing ultimate judgment, and bringing about the fullness of the kingdom forever and ever. And the woman who you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Okay, let me just explain these things to you, because the angels just explained them, but obviously with time constraints, I've read that really quickly. So the 7 heads, we're told, are 7 kings. They're also described as 7 mountains. Why is that? Well, kings biblically are usually described as sitting on a mountain. That the mountain represents their kingdom or their authority or their power. So the 7 heads are 7 kings or 7 mountains. And throughout Old Testament prophecy, mountains represent the power of kingdoms, but it also represents the power of their original king. So they're kind of interrelated. And in the book of Daniel, why you're now thinking, so why did we go into all those kingdoms and all that sort of stuff? Well, that's because we needed to do that so we can see what Revelation is talking about, and it's clearly talking about these kingdoms. You remember in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we saw the 4 metals, and then in the vision we saw that Daniel had, we saw 4 beasts, and they represented 4 kingdoms. And we also had that picture in Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the feet of clay and iron with the 10 toes. And in Daniel's vision, we had the beast with 10 horns. And in Daniel's vision, the 10 horns was said to be on the head of the 4th beast. So that's really helpful when we come to this passage and we go, what is that talking about? What is it talking about? That he's the 7th kingdom, but he's also the 8th kingdom, and so on. Well, it all fits together when you realize that this is kind of looking at the evolution of evil from the time of Babel to the time of the end. And remember, Daniel was shown 4 beasts, which was said to be 4 kings that arose out of the earth. We studied that in detail over a couple of weeks, Daniel chapter 7. And unlike when we studied it looking at Daniel, by John's time, those 4 beasts, those 4 kingdoms, John knows what they are. They've already happened. So Daniel didn't know them, and despite the fact that the angel told him about stuff that was for the future and wasn't, blew Daniel's mind when this idea of this Greek empire and so on and these other kingdoms were presented to him, unlike Daniel, John's looking back. And what we are told in this passage in Revelation is that one of those kingdoms is, in other words, it's right now, it's right in John's time. So when we tie that to Daniel's kingdom, this entire sweep of history, the entire sweep of man's rebellion against God, that is epitomized by this beast, we find out that at that point it describes a kingdom that is. Well, what's the kingdom when John is there? Well, that's the Roman kingdom. That's the one that is upon the earth. That's that one that has the vicious teeth that crushes everything and nothing can stand in its way. So we can locate in this vision we'll be given, we can locate the Roman kingdom, because it says this kingdom that is. And so going back from that, and that's said to be the sixth kingdom here. So going back from that, you've got the Greek, you've got the Medo-Persian, you've got the Babylonian, and then this is, remember, is the full span of the history of man's rebellion from Babel. So the first kingdom is Nimrod. So we're missing a kingdom, and basically people get really bothered about this. They go like, okay, what is that? And they make all sorts of suggestions about what it might be and so on. I could give you all sorts of logic about what that might be. Some people think it's Assyria, some people think it's somewhere else. But the point here is that in Revelation, at this point, we are looking at things also, I believe, from the context of God's dealings with Israel. Because what God is doing here by judging Babylon is he's fulfilling his promises to Israel that their enemies, the people who have conquered them, will ultimately be judged for the evil that they have visited upon them. And so I think that these six kingdoms are those who are in relation to Israel. So I think that missing kingdom, so we've got Babel at the start, and then we've got Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greek, and Roman, which is John's time and is identified in this vision. I think the missing kingdom is Egypt, basically because that is the one that also ruled over Israel. Each of these tried to dominate Israel. When they rebel, each of those kingdoms rule over Israel. So I actually think, I personally think it's Egypt. I could go on for hours about all the arguments, counter arguments, etc. But that's my view. So we've got six kingdoms: Babel, Egypt, Babylon, Medo-Persian, Greek, the kingdom that now is, which is Rome, and then we've got these two other ones. We've got the seventh that comes out of 10 kingdoms, and the 10 kingdoms give their power to it, but is also the eighth. And what we're told is that the seventh rises out of these 10 kingdoms, but we're also said, but the seventh is also the eighth, which is really odd, isn't it? That they're both the same. Well, it's not really odd if you realize that in the context of this vision, what it's saying is the seventh kingdom is that 10 toes or feet of iron and clay, but it's also the 10 horns, which 3 horns are taken and the little horn appears. What it's saying is that the seventh kingdom is the kingdom of the Antichrist. So when does it become the eighth? It becomes the eighth when it is no longer the kingdom of the Antichrist, but it is the kingdom of Satan, who has now possessed the Antichrist. And that's the kingdom that is to be. So that you've got the seventh kingdom and the eighth kingdom. They're both the same physical body, but two different personalities in that physical body. So then we move on to chapter 18. And I want to show you something here, why these two things are interrelated. The physical place of Babylon that God has promised to Israel would ultimately be judged and destroyed without trace. Babylon has never been without trace. The ruins have always been there. They've always been above ground. There's great big pieces of stone that relate to ancient Babylon. It's never been erased without trace. It's always been there. There's always been people who have settled there. But after its destruction by the empires that took it over, it's never really risen. But it's always been there. So, but God has still got this promise that he is going to destroy Babylon so utterly that there is no trace of it left. And he's promised that to Israel. So we've got the judgment not only of the spiritual system, but of the physical place of Babylon. And the thing is, that is interesting here is how does God judge something that isn't here yet? And it's a bit like with the temple. There's this physical place that it looks like, it's not absolutely certain because it could just all be the spiritual system it's talking about, but it looks like that this physical place also needs to be there in order to be utterly destroyed, because God will fulfill every promise he's already given. So we've got, let's go to, let me just read you one of those prophecies. This is from Isaiah. No, I'll read you the Jeremiah one. I'll send the Isaiah one. I'll give you the reference. Flee from Babylon, run for your lives. Do not be destroyed because of her sins. It is time for the Lord's vengeance. He will pay her what she deserves. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. Can you see? This Old Testament prophecy is now getting reflected right at the end in Revelation. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine. Therefore, they have now gone mad. There's a madness in the world right now, I tell you. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her. Get balm for her pain. Perhaps she can be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she cannot be healed. She cannot be rebuilt. She cannot be restored. Let us leave her and each go to his own land, for her judgment reaches to the sky and it rises as high as the cloud. I don't know what that means, but I think that means her judgment is so huge that people can see it for a vast area. And when we get to this final fall of Babylon, what we'll see is that visibility across the vast area is absolutely there. Now I'm going to show you, I said that it looks like there needs to be a physical place called Babylon. I'm going to show you something now that some of you probably know about, but we need to kind of be aware of. And I'm going back onto screen share. So this is a picture from the New York Times back in 2006 when Iraq was occupied by American troops. And what we have here is at the front of the picture, the ruins of the original city of Babylon, and we've got some restoration of the walls. And when the American troops went in, they were shocked to find this, because what they found was that Saddam Hussein had taken it upon himself to start rebuilding Babylon, and he was effectively going to, the idea was that he would restore the power of Babylon and he'd exert his power from there. And when they went in and found this, the United Nations adopted this site as an educational, cultural site. And they've, ever since this, I can't remember when this was, 2005, 2006, ever since this, they've been pumping millions and millions of dollars into rebuilding Babylon as a kind of historical museum site. And if everything goes according to plan, what we'll find is in pretty short shift, there'll be a cultural centre here, complete with shopping malls, hotels, theme parks, and all the rest of it. So that's the plan, and that's already underway. So that's what Babylon used to look like. As you can see, there is still traces of it. It's still visible. It hadn't been completely destroyed. It could be rebuilt because they could find it. So that wasn't the fulfillment of that prophecy from Jeremiah. That's what Babylon was looking like a few years ago. So as you can see, a lot of it has been rebuilt. That's kind of a wide angle panoramic shot. They've reconstructed the gate of Babylon. You remember, I think I probably mentioned this in an earlier session, the original of that now sits in the museum in Berlin because Hitler had it shipped piece by piece back to Berlin and reconstructed. And that's the Ishtar gate that Nebuchadnezzar had at the entrance to his city. And so they've rebuilt one of those. And that is Saddam Hussein's palace that he built on Babylon. So that's what stands there right now. And he intended that as a symbol of his glory. But this thing has risen from the ashes in the space of about 20 years. That's what is there. Again, this is a few years ago, and that's what you now see. And you can see that the whole thing is getting reconstructed as it was back in the Old Testament times before its destruction. So you can see that it's actually possible that a physical Babylon could be destroyed, because it's this idea of let's create a cultural centre with theme parks, shopping malls, all the rest of it. Now let's see what God has to say about that. Let me just go to Revelation chapter 18, and I'm not particularly going to comment on this because a lot of this you will now understand what it's saying from what the lead up I've given you. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. He had great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. Remember, this is a drilling down of that seventh bowl judgment. The mighty earthquake, the hail, the storms. With a mighty voice, he shouted, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She," again, that overlap between the spirit, the harlot, and the physical place. "She has become a home for demons and a haunt of every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries." It's just like God is just like pulling everything together. Every word is coming into place. Every prophecy is coming to fulfillment. "The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries." The spirit of the age, the spirit behind commercialism, greed, pride, and man's desire to show himself successful. Then I heard another voice from heaven say, "Come out of her, my people. Do not be part of that system, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. For her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Give back to her she is given. Pay her back double for what she's done. Mix her double portion from her own cup." I just think that's an incredible statement. You remember that cup has been described as a cup full of abominations. Right from the start, right from the fall, right from man's rebellion, right at the beginning of Genesis, it has been true that God has pronounced judgment, and that judgment is that the wages of sin is death. And so that is all been held, that is all been stored, that cup of abominations is now going to get its wages. And that's what this is saying. It's saying the final wrapping up of everything, the final judgment, the final time has come to give an account of everything and deal with everything. And the systems and the people and the spirits behind all of this are going to get all that cup back and double. They are being judged by their own evil. And what they are receiving on earth right at that moment is the result of their own evil. It's not something God's done. It's the pouring out of their own evil. God, through grace, has restrained the full consequences of evil on earth, and now he's removed the restraint. And all their evil is coming back to them. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her, death and mourning and famine, and she's going to be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. When the kings of the earth who committed adultery with her and shared her luxury see the smoke of her burning, they will weep and mourn over her, terrified at her torment. They will stand far off and cry, woe, woe, O great city of Babylon, city of power. In 1 hour, earthquake, hail, in 1 hour, your doom has come. The merchants of the earth weep and mourn over her because no one buys their cargoes anymore. Remember all those rivers that went up to Babylon? The merchants plied their trade on their rivers. They came from the sea. They brought gold, silver, precious stones, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk and scarlet cloth, all the goods of the world, cinnamon, myrrh, etc., etc. And they'll say, the fruit you long for is gone from you. All your riches, all your splendor have vanished, never to be recovered. God's keeping his promise. Babylon is going forever physically, and Babylon is going forever spiritually. And the merchants who sold their things, the people who plied and pumped and promoted this whole system right across the earth, the people who indulged in this whole system, the people that were behind the philosophy of all this system, the people that said this is the only way to live your life, they are going to stand, they're going to see the fall of this place and this system, and they're going to be terrified and in torment and weep and mourn, because everything they've invested their life in to get money, to get goods, to get possessions, to get status, to get power is coming down, and all that they have left is to weep. Verse 17, every sea captain, in 1 hour such great wealth has been brought to ruin. Every sea captain, all who travel by ship, the sailors and all in them living from the sea will stand far off. When they see the smoke of her burning, they will exclaim, was there ever a city like this great city? And they will throw dust on their heads and with weeping and mourning cry out, woe, woe, a great city where all who had ships on the sea became rich through her wealth. In 1 hour she has been brought to ruin. Rejoice over her, O heaven. So you see this contrast between the weeping and mourning of those who've invested their lives in the world system, their lives in their career, their lives in possessions, their lives in getting much. They weep and mourn, and yet heaven over the same event rejoices. Rejoice, saints and apostles and prophets. God has judged her. God has judged that system for the way she treated you. The mighty angel picked up a boulder of the size of a large millstone, threw it in the sea, and said, with such violence, the great city of Babylon will be thrown down, never to be found again. And then it goes on to say, you know, people, music, everything's never going to be heard in there again. The real background to this story, and the real background to these physical events that will happen, but also the spiritual reality behind them, is there is 2 kingdoms on the earth. And every person and us right now, we have this choice between which kingdom we're going to invest our life in, which system we're going to invest our life in. Are we going to pursue all the things of the world, the kingdom of Babylon, run our lives according to the world, or are we going to pursue the kingdom of heaven? There is no middle ground. You're in one or the other. And what this is telling us is, if you invest badly, if you just run with the way of the world, that is coming down, and you will end up in weeping and mourning, because you have put all your store, all your security and all your comfort in that place. So choose life, choose the kingdom, be people who are not caught up in this, who are not invested in this, because it's going to be judged. And on that happy note, it gets better from here on in. We've had all the bad news now. Everything's just coming to a big culmination now. So this was the start of all the good stuff, where God's just restoring all things, and we end up with a kingdom that is forever and ever. And so we'll continue with that next week.